Hello and welcome to episode number 95 of the Nerd Pro Quote podcast. Really exciting episode with Taylor Molly that many of you may or may not know from an infamous and very widely shared poem called What Teachers Make. We definitely unpack that and the history of that a little bit. But before we get started with that, just some quick plugs. Union Square Slam, I believe, is still going. It is still going as far as this podcast is going up. It is this Tuesday. It is at the Bureau of General Services Queer Division in the LGBT Community Center. You guys should know this by now. It's 7 p.m. It's a $5 cover. It is all ages. There is a free workshop at 6 p.m. Also, the Living Room Comedy Show with very likely a couple of former podcast guests, Aaron Camino Smith, Luke Thayer, and Abby Crutchfield. Almost always one of them is at that show. That is every Friday at the Postmark Cafe, which is 6th Street between 4th and 5th Avenue in Park Slope, Brooklyn. Also, we talk about this at the end of the podcast, but I also wanted to mention it at the top. The Next Page Meets Stage, which is a reading series that Taylor Molly curates, is going to be John Murillo and Kate Meisner. I'm pretty sure I have mentioned Kate Meisner on this podcast. I would love to have her on the podcast. She's kind of a superhero as far as being a working artist and doing a lot of exciting things with women's empowerment, and she's an amazing poet. John Murillo, if you don't know who John Murillo is, you should go look up his poems. Also just incredible poet, and that is going to be an amazing show, and that is Wednesday, May 11th at the Celebration of Whimsy. I believe it is at 7:30 p.m. and it is $12 cover, though I believe, I'm not sure if this has been mentioned. There will be a link in doobly-doo about this. But I believe if you say, I am a blue flower child, or something along those lines, there's probably a statement you could say you could get in for half price. But that is Wednesday, May 11th. You should definitely go to that show. I'm going to try and make it to that show. I might not be able to afford it, but it is amazing. And John Murillo and Kate Meisner are amazing. There will be, I have not nailed down the venue yet. The 100th episode of the podcast is coming in June. It will be live. It will be 2 separate episodes. It's going to be amazing. More details on that as they come together. But in the meantime, enjoy this episode number 95 of the Nerd Pro Quo podcast with Taylor Molly. 2 things. There are a couple little edits you're going to notice in this podcast because we ran into a couple of audio problems in different spots, so I had to make little cuts. Also, for those of you who are sticklers about this, especially because Taylor has a poem about this, about what he calls filler words, when he discusses them, and those of you who know Taylor, about using the word because I know there are internet trolls who will probably bring this up. He does say the word a couple times in this podcast, but keep in mind, the man is a very, very recent father, so I think we can forgive him for that. That being said, I'm sure when this goes up, there will be plenty of comments. Subscribe to the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, check out the other episodes, nerdproco.com/podcast. At NerdProCo on Twitter. Let us know what you think. Hit subscribe. Be nice about it. Or if you're going to be an asshole about it, be an asshole towards me, the host. Don't be an asshole towards the guest, Taylor. So, yeah, let us know what your thoughts are about it. I love hearing from you. I know I don't always respond, and by don't always, I almost never respond. It doesn't mean that I don't read them. I always read the comments. And yeah, enjoy this episode number 95 of Nerd Pro Code Podcast with Taylor Molly. So let us start with introducing yourself and telling people who you are. And if you want to go with a definition of yourself, of what you consider yourself to be, you can do that. If not, you can just say your name.
Do people say a definition of themselves? And
Well, some people go with oh, my name is so, like the last person who was on the podcast was Dove. And he was just like, oh, I'm a soul singer, poet, beatboxer, whatever.
Right.
You don't have to do
I'm Taylor Molly. I'm a poet. I'm an itinerant creative writing teacher and motivational speaker.
Okay.
And a former teacher and a slam poet, and that's what I do.
So let's.
And the former voice of Burger King commercials.
Okay. Because we will get to that, but let's start kind of with how you and I met and how I know you.
From Urbana, right?
Yeah.
The Urbana Poetry Slam.
And I don't know if you would remember how we met, because I don't remember. And I would say we probably met at least 5 times before.
I'm famous for not remembering. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But you were. I probably saw you a couple of times and thought, "That's the new young guy who's funny. That's the new young Shappy."
Yeah.
I probably thought of you as Mini Shappy for about 5 times.
I can almost guarantee that. In fact, I can tell you a story in which the New York Comic Con that Shappy and me did poetry at.
Oh, I know. You were accidentally dressed exactly alike.
Yeah, and we had almost identical backpacks, and I have never looked more like that man's son than in that moment that we were walking. And I turned to him and I looked at him and then looked at myself, and I was just like, oh dear Lord,
Papa,
this has happened. Yeah, Papa.
So you and I know each other from back in the day,
from
New York City Poetry Slam scene.
So let's kind of start there. How did you get, number one, into poetry? Probably goes back further than that, I'm assuming, for you.
Mm-hmm.
But how did you get into spoken word, and how did that get you to Urbana? Was that through Kristen? Like, what is this story, the history and the story there?
My father was a poet. My father was a occasional poet who would write poems for special occasions. So I remember him from an early age getting up and reciting these poems at weddings and birthdays. And so for me, poetry was always a very public art form. And I went to grad school for poetry. I was an English major at Bowdoin College. Oh, listen, before we go on, because this is always interesting to me when I listen to podcasts, I just want to say that today's Tuesday, May 3rd, and it's the night of the Indiana primary. And we just found out that Donald Trump is projected to have won Indiana. Just so that people can sort of place this in time, Prince died about a week ago.
Right.
We just found out that Jon Snow is alive on Game of Thrones.
Yes. This is by no means intentional, but we are recording this on a Tuesday. And apparently today is also National Teacher Appreciation Day.
It is. No. It's the week.
It's
the whole week.
It's this whole week. Oh, so by the time this goes up, we will still hopefully be in that.
Maybe,
and
yeah.
I totally did not.
You didn't plan this. You didn't plan that. Well, good planning. Good accident. It's just
good
take credit. Take
synchronicity.
credit. My Twitter feed has been blowing up since yesterday. What teachers make has been reposted.
Of course, yes.
Happy Teacher Day. And I tweeted yesterday, thank you to all teachers who actually do what I only write poems about once having done.
Yes.
Yeah.
And published a book about
it,
actually,
of course, right.
which we will also get to.
Sure.
There are many things, but
I went to grad school for poetry, but it was slam. Ironically, I went to grad school in Kansas in 1990, in the fall of 1990, which was virtually the same month that the first National Poetry Slam Championships were happening in the Bay Area of California, which is where I had left. So if I had not gone to graduate school, I would have discovered slam likely many years earlier than I actually did. I went off to graduate school. I loved my time in Kansas. I got to be a better poet. I got to be a better academic, a better student. a better writer, a better teacher. I came out of that grad school, Kansas State University, not thinking that I was going to be a poet as a career, because that's just stupid.
That's not a thing.
That's not a
even
thing.
Even now, it's very few people.
Right. Well, back then it was Ginsberg, and that was it. Right? And I was a teacher. I was a teacher for a while, and but I discovered slam my last year in grad school. There was a slam in Lawrence, Kansas, at a strip club that would give the dancers the night off on every fourth Monday and invite the poets on stage to reveal themselves.
So, just interestingly, before we started recording off mic, we were talking about the similarities between slam poetry and stand-up. And just as you said that, I was like, oh, yeah, that's how a lot of stand-up nights start.
They start in strip clubs?
They start in venues that were clearly designed for something else.
Oh, right, because there's a pole on stage.
Yeah.
Right.
There have definitely been stand-ups who have hosted strip things. There have been,
Sure.
I've known a couple people who've been hired to do like, oh, there's this event that's at a strip club. Can you MC? And it's, but what I mean about that is that comedy and poetry, number one, tend to be in some of the, when it's not in a club stand-up, tend to be in the same venues, and a lot of times tend to be venues that were not designed for what.
Right. Yeah.
So that prompts me to ask, how was performing poetry with stripper poles? Was that?
Well, it's, the first time, we'll probably get to this as well. I now run a series in New York called Page Meets Stage, where the Pulitzer Prize meets the Poetry Slam. And as part of sort of my ongoing promotion of that, I go to a satellite XM radio interview. And I took Neil Hilborn because he was on the show in April. He was part of the pairing against Jared Singer. Not against, but, Jared Singer meets Neil Hilborn. And I brought Neil with me to the interview, and he said, and I agree, that the first time you ever perform poetry, you are just incredibly nervous. And as he said, he was so nervous he vomited a little in his mouth. And the MC said, "I'm sorry, was that the name of the poem?" I thought that was funny. That it was at this strip club that I got over my nerves. The first time I performed a poem out loud, I didn't have it memorized, and I was so nervous that this started to happen. My hands were shaking that you could hear it, you could see it. And the next month when I went back, I decided to Xerox my poems on cardstock, so that if my hands shook, at least they wouldn't make noise. And so I kept sort of doing these cheats and workarounds to try to disguise my nervousness. And as I tell my own students now, the way to get rid of the nervous shakes when you're reciting poetry in front of an audience is actually there's nothing. There's nothing you can do except perform 10 more times. Because somehow 11 times up on stage, and you suddenly realize I'm not shaking anymore. So that's where I discovered slam, and then I'm a substitute teacher in Maine. I start a slam. I go to the National Slam final championships. I figure out what's going on. I get better at it. Third year at the Nationals, I win with Providence. I come back the next year. I win again with Mouth Almighty, which was a controversial team. I'd moved to New York. I knew that I wasn't going to be welcome on the New Eurekan team, so I started my own venue, and then I took 98 off. I come back. I win again in 2000. I win again in 2002, and then you win the Nationals 4 times, and I kind of had my. I knew that I could make a living. I didn't know I could make a living doing this, but I knew that it was something I needed to try.
So around that time, so somewhere in between there, or like after that, the individual poetry slam and the National Poetry Slam become two separate things.
Right.
So when you say that you won, your team won.
I'm
and
talking about my team. I mean, there were years that back in the day, the National Poetry Slam which was always a team competition, because Mark Smith, so what, at the very first Nationals, when he was invited by Gary Glazner to come to San Francisco in 1990, Gary basically said, hey, what is this thing in Chicago that you've been doing called Poetry Slam? Why don't you come out to the Bay Area and teach us what you do? And Mark, I'm probably getting the facts wrong, but Mark said, well, why don't we have a competition? Why don't we, because Bob Holman has been doing this thing in a similar thing based on my invention in New York, and we could bring a team out. So the very first Nationals, from what I understand, was New York versus Chicago versus San Francisco, and Chicago won, because they were sort of teaching the rest of the world the art form. But Mark, who could have said, yes, if you pay my way, I will fly out there and I will teach a workshop on what slam is. You know, from the get-go, at that point, he said, let's make this a team thing. So it was for the first, 10 years, the NPS, the National Poetry Slam, was a team competition, which nevertheless had a individual element on the side, a parallel tournament. Everybody competes as a team on the first 2 nights. And then if you competed for your team as an individual on those 2 nights, and your score was high enough, you got invited into this separate competition, which happened on Friday night after all the other bouts, which was the individual competition. It made for the team dynamic at the Nationals it really complicated things, and egos got in the way, and people said, well, I've got, of course I'm going to go last in on our team, because I want our team to do well, but just in case our team doesn't do well, I want to do well in the individuals. So I had years where I was where I also made it to the individuals, years where I insisted on going last for my team, but I really feel that. But I won when I say I won the National Poetry Slam 4 times, it's with 4 different teams, largely different teams. 3 of those were with the Urbana Poetry Slam, and Bo Seo was on 2 of those teams, and Selena Glenn, aka Black Cracker, was on 2 of those teams. So I had some of the same people, but no, unlike Patricia Smith, who won the individual championship, being on teams from Boston, although I think going last every time. I won it with 4 different teams, but I also I stopped going last for my team, because I realized like half of my success is due to my realizing loopholes and gray areas that could be exploited 18 months before anybody else did. I think.
Well, I have 3 things that I want to ask.
And one of those was going first for my team instead of last.
The first one is, were group pieces, how early did group pieces, was that an element?
I think at the very first Nationals, somebody busted out a group piece, and the other team said, "No fair, that's no fair. You can't do that." And they said, which I'm famous for saying, "Show me where it says you can't."
Right.
And that was Lisa King, rest in peace, I think, was the first group piece. And she said, "You know what? This piece is more than just one voice, so let's all do it." And so I think from the very get-go, group pieces were a thing. They certainly have become more of a thing. And I don't know when the last team that won the National Poetry Slam Championships did so without a group piece.
So, and the two things that I want to bring up that are kind of connected, where does Slam Nation fall into this time period? If it does, maybe it was. I don't know the exact period. And also, it seems like that very early on you realized this is kind of as seriously as we take our work. This is also a game that can be played and strategic. Apparently, word I'm having trouble saying, but you know the word.
Strategized.
Yes,
It can be strategized, right?
Which I don't even know if that's a word. No, it's not a word. Of course not. And also, somehow through Slam Nation and the fact that, you realize that, I don't know how else to phrase this, but you kind of became what in professional wrestling would be referred to as a heel for a lot of people.
It sounds like a bad thing.
The reason why I say
it sounds like a necessary bad thing.
Yeah, where the
I
reason
was
why
I
I
was
say
the necessary I was a necessary
professional
bad
wrestling is that the heel is the bad guy, but it's the bad guy in wrestling that he's not really a bad guy. That's just the role he's playing in this fake game that we've created.
Right.
Which is, I don't think I've ever made a parallel between slam poetry and professional wrestling, but somehow it weirdly seems to fit in a lot of ways.
No, you're absolutely right. And I was the heel. I was the bad guy who was not the real bad guy, but I knew this art form needs a bad guy.
Right.
And Slam Nation was Paul Devlin's documentary about the 1996 Nationals.
Okay.
It came out in 1997, so he just happened to be sending cameras the first year that I won. He had been hanging around the New Eurekan Poets Cafe. He had probably seen Saul Williams rise through the ranks at the Nuyo and thought, this guy's amazing. And he was. And I remember being... Curiously, I was at the New Eurekan the night they formed their team. I had built this database that was going to be used as a slam scorer, which was the beginning of, you and I have hung out at Urbana. You've run the scorer that this became. And so I had gone up to Bob, who I barely knew, and said, hey, I have this is a busy night. This is an important night. You need it to go fast. I have this new type of computer. It's 1996. I have a new type of computer called a laptop. It's a computer that sits on my lap. This is 21 years ago, right? No, 20 years ago. 20 years, 1996. And so I was sitting in the corner keeping score on that night. And Paul Devlin, months later when he's making the movie, he called me up and said, what the fuck are you doing in my shot at the Nuyo? Like, you already have the reputation of being the heel and the cheater. Why? How am I supposed to explain to the audience that you, the guy who ended up winning, was in the Nuyo, the team that was supposed to win? So he had everybody felt the Nuyo was supposed to win, and they really should have, and they could have if they'd played their cards right. But on that night in that year in 1996, and so that's what I don't know where I was going with that. 1997 that comes out, and so that's definitely in that timeline. But yeah, slam is a competition,
right?
And so if you think it's all about good poetry, if you think every opportunity you have on the mic is an opportunity to educate the audience as to what good poetry can and should be, well, I'm sorry, you're going to lose. You're going to lose because you're not thinking of the audience. A successful slammer goes into a slam, perhaps with an idea of what she wants to do, and you listen to the scores that the first poets get, and you read the room, and you go, okay, I'm going to change my strategy. That's not going to work anymore. Whereas a slam poet who's really bound to the page would say, no, I think this audience is going to respond when I lay my brilliance at their feet.
See, I have a couple times both done. I've done depending on where I was mentally that night. I've done and you've definitely seen me do this a couple times at Urbana, where I either decide I'm gonna do what I'm gonna do, regardless. A couple times I've gone one of two ways. And one of the ways was like, why don't you ever? One of them is it's basically when I realize I've been mapped out, and I decide I don't care, and I've been told, and I don't do this as much anymore, but it's just like, oh, then you do the best version of your poem because you don't care. But I've also done the I don't care, therefore I'm gonna do this, and once that is how the Swedish Chef poem ends up coming out, and I am in competition. Outside of competition, people love that poem. Inside of a competition, there are people who are just like, "Why would you do that? Fuck you! Why would you do that?"
Have you ever been to Sweden?
No.
Okay. I was married to a Swedish person. I've been to Sweden. I've taught in Sweden, and I've performed in Sweden maybe a half dozen times. And I've done my Swedish Chef routine. I don't have a poem like you do, but I can. I grew up with the Muppet Show, and I can do a pretty good imitation of the Swedish Chef.
What's funny is that poem is not what I think pissed people off about that is when I do that poem, it's never pre-written.
Oh, good for you.
It's always I've found that there's a couple of lines that have crept into it every time I do it, just because it's like. But every time I do that, it's new because I tend to string. And the one time when people got really pissed off is I accidentally strung a bunch of topics and or subjects together, not realizing it's like, oh, these together, there seems to be like an ascending or descending nature to these. And then even on stage, I was like, oops. I strung those together. That was a bad idea.
No. I once wrote a poem that was a Mad Lib poem where I said, give me an adjective, give me a number, give me a liquid, and then I did the poem, and the adjective somebody gave me was black. And it just happened that in the poem, I was going to be talking about the blank man.
Oh dear.
And it was like, Mr. Black Man. And I was like, oh, this is a disaster. I didn't have your stand-up comedian's skills to roll with it.
Well, this was just one of those things where it was just like topics that happened to, as I was doing, pop together.
Right.
And it turned out that they were connected to each other, and I was just like, oh, it wasn't even that they were connected that came off as like offensive or whatever. It was the fact that it was in the context of what is supposed to be a humorous send-up of a slam poem, and I was just like, oh, these are the whatever. Because the first time I ever did it, basically what I did was I walked around the room before I did the poem and said, write down a slam cliche or like a poem cliche. And that worked out really well, but I found that the more times I did, like there was not even cliches, but like stuff that came up a lot in a night. And if it was stuff that came up a lot in a night, if you strung it together the wrong way, it was like, oh, you're making fun of this. I was like, oh, no, I'm not making fun of the specific topics.
Well, I very early on in my slam career, we're talking 95, 96, one of the things that I used to do was and you were hinting at this before, I would make fun of the art form.
Right.
And one of my earliest poems and it was called I Think I Could Be a Poet. And it mocked the way poets read in the early 90s with that poet voice going up at the end of every line. And although the poem as written makes fun of the way poets read in general,
yeah,
I always found that it was more effective if I could throw in a couple of lines that made fun of how poets read in specific. Poets who had read right before me. So if there was someone who had a memorable catchphrase, I would throw it into the poem. If there was someone who had a memorable gesture, I would throw it into the poem. And that caused that caused all kinds of consternation among the community. My favorite quote is the Latin poet Horace said, "I have had to do much in order to pacify the touchy tribe of poets." And in the 2,000 years since Horace wrote that, we've never become much more than a touchy tribe of poets.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to get into this, but one of the reasons I've kind of fallen off from doing slams and everything and done more stand up is that kind of context is very important to what you're doing. And I've run into this time and time again, and I get it because it's the nature of everything that the slam community, everything that's beautiful about the slam community ends up in a very weird way being everything that ends up being a problem with the slam community. It's like they're kind of the same things. Is just from what if you're doing what you're doing, is just like the inability, or just like people take stuff very seriously and very personally, and it's just like, as someone who came from stand up to go to slam, my thing is like, okay, we don't have enough of it. And what I loved about you and Shappy especially is that kind of we should be having a good time. This should be fun. We should have a sense of humor about this. It's not that important to like what we're doing.
Well, to answer your question, let's not go there.
Yes.
Let's not go there. But I do like what you said off mic, which is the difference between slam audiences and stand-up audiences, is that a slam audience feels that they deserve to be in a safe space.
Yeah.
And I think nobody goes to a stand-up show thinking that they're going to...
You'd be surprised how many people... I mean, there was a thing...
Go to stand-up shows and then get
upset. It's a continuing trend.
Right, okay.
A lot of that has to do with the fact that stand-up largely is still a very white male.
So they're learning. They're learning just like everybody else.
Yeah, where it's like, oh, they're top. It's like it. The big shift that's been happening. I don't know why but it's come up. Is the big shift that's happening in the stand-up community is if you're doing this certain types of, if you're joking about certain things and you're a white male, the argument of it's starting to shift over where you can't just say it's just a joke. That's starting to become too much of a cop-out.
Yeah.
It's like if you're going to joke about these things, you have to, if people get offended, you have to either be able to defend it in some way or articulate. It was like this, you end up, and the reluctance is that once you do that, you end up kind of killing that joke. Is, no, that you have to explain context to people. And once you explain context to the person, the joke is no longer funny because you've dissected it. But I think the shift in the comedy community is that like there are certain things you can't joke about anymore, or if you are going to joke about them, you have to be more skilled. And it's
bring it on.
It's even starting to trickle down to the open mics.
Oh, good.
Like there's like everyone has the big thing about rape jokes is like, I've even seen this like really high level guys like Louis C.K. It was like, well, they'll still make a quote unquote rape joke, but it's a joke about something else that includes rape in it, or it's never, the general rule is it can't be about the victim. It has to be about the concept of rape and like how preposterous and horrible that is in society. And I've even seen that start to trickle down into open mics where if someone makes a joke and it's not skillfully done, even in an open mic where it's 90% other comedians, the other comedians will just go, you might want to reconsider that. Like they won't boo at you and they won't troll you on the internet, but even other comedians in open mics are starting to be like, okay, if you're going to joke about that, you need to be more skillful about it.
Well, you know, Daniel Tosh started this. He got in trouble a couple of years ago making rape jokes based on audience suggestions. You know,
right.
What do you want me to talk about? And somebody yelled out rape, and he just off the top of his head made a joke, and it fell flat. And I remember comedians talking about it, and I remember hearing Whoopi Goldberg on The View, not a show I watched, but I don't know how I ended up watching this, and she said, there is no line of what is acceptable. If you're skillful and you get away with it and people laugh, then then you didn't cross the line.
I will tell you that there's a very specific situation that is actually the Daniel Tosh thing, which has been addressed ad nauseum on this podcast.
Well, then we don't
have to get into it.
But I heard Louis C.K. say you should never rape anyone unless you want to have sex with them and they don't want to.
Yeah. But
which is, there's no reason why that shouldn't be offensive. And yet somehow he's skillful enough that it's...
Well, what's funny about that is that he did that, and that's an earlier special, and in later specials, because this is what comedians who really work at their craft. George Carlin is famous for this. If you watch successive specials, you'll see the same bit, essentially, or the same concept, and it's just as it progresses, there's a different... So he has a similar joke he has an entire bit in his most recent special. Well, the most recent one that he didn't release himself. Sorry, I'm going into the weeds here. Is similar, but it's it starts with like the greatest threats to men's lives, heart disease, whatever. The greatest threat to women's lives is men.
Right. So that's why he feels so optimistic about society when he sees any couples on a date.
But it is, and I've seen him do. It's a joke about women and men and sexual violence, but I've seen it like from where the joke that you said is like that's where he was a couple of years ago, and then here's what that's become in this later. It's the same. Yeah. It's essentially he's addressing the same issue.
There's a level of enlightenment that he's gotten to. In one of the episodes of Louis, he's kissing his ex-girlfriend goodbye, and she doesn't want him, and she says, "God, you don't even know how to rape." And it's like, oh my God, who thought that was okay? Yeah. And why do I think that's...
Yeah.
I'm a terrible poem. I'm a terrible poem for thinking that he actually got away with that.
Well, and to a certain extent, I mean, there have been comedians who have said that, first, that the core of all comedy is I think it was Mel Brooks who said it's a rebellion against something. And if you're not offending something or someone, chances are you're a very boring comedian.
Right. I used to say, and let's get back onto the poetry where I feel more on sure footing. I used to say out loud to an audience that my goal was to offend one person by the time the evening was over, which is so dumb.
Right.
Even if that is your goal, it should never be stated.
Yeah,
out loud.
You don't state that,
because then you say something, and let's say I'm overseas. I do a lot of gigs at international schools, where you're not even aware of what the culture of the school is, and it's got a mix of parents of different religions, and they go to the head of the upper school and say, he said he wanted to offend one person, and let me tell you, he did that.
Yeah, and so, I am the one person.
I am the one person.
So just going back, through your master's program or through college, you started teaching. How did that?
After Kansas State University, I didn't think anybody could be a poet. So what do? What do most poets do? They end up teaching. A lot of my friends from the program went on to get PhDs and teach college, and I decided I'm going to teach high school and I'm going to teach middle school. So I did that for 9 years, and then I wrote a lot of poems about teaching and what teachers make. I wrote based on an experience I had New Year's Eve, 1997 or 8, where I had gone to a party and been insulted by this lawyer who he didn't mean to insult the entire teaching
Of course.
profession. There are a lot of things I don't say in that poem. Like, he's very charismatic. It was his house. I make it sound like a dinner party in the poem. I'm not going to do the poem. So if no.
Yeah, no.
It's easy enough to find. There were 150 people at the party. It's not a dinner party. It was his house. He was a little drunk. He looked great in his tuxedo. He's 6'5", and he's very good looking. So I was slightly intimidated. And when he said, because he said some version of, "Oh, you're a teacher, Taylor. Come on, be honest. What do you make?" As a way of trying to belittle me by trying to prove who would willingly become a teacher, knowing that teachers are so badly compensated in this day and age, and anyone who would willingly become a teacher is obviously so stupid they shouldn't be allowed to be a teacher. That's the basic gist of his argument. But what I don't say in the poem is that when he said, "Come on, be honest, Taylor, what do you make?" my answer was $28,500.
Of course it was.
Yeah, and so the poem "What Teachers Make," which I wrote, January 1st, started writing January 1st of the next day, which was either January 1st, 1998 or 1999, is to a certain extent what I wish I had said instead of $28,500.
So, just because when did that, I don't know exactly how to, but like parsing out the history of that, because it's now, because I think the most recent thing was someone who I think made a video version of the poem,
like an acted out version.
Yeah, and it wasn't even like credited to you or something. It's like at some
that
point,
poem's been plagiarized and sent around the world multiple times.
So just to kind of parse out the history a little bit, is like, when did you know, or did you become aware that it had become a phenomenon, kind of, in its own? And when do you think it became like, oh, at least for you, it was like, oh, this doesn't even belong to me anymore?
Well, I've never said that. And I should mention, you're sitting underneath a comic poster of what teachers make. This Zen Pencils is I think maybe 3 years ago, my Twitter feed exploded because this guy, Gavin, who goes by the name of Zen Pencils on Twitter, who likes to just write comic versions of inspirational pieces of writing, had done a version of my poem, that version, which is hanging on the wall over your head, and people were saying, I want to buy this poster. And he said, hold on, this is a poem by Taylor Mali. I don't even have permission from him to do this.
Right.
And I wrote and said, I am Taylor Mali. I give you permission, and I want a copy of that poster.
Sure.
But it's my own fault that the poem got taken away from me, because in 1998 or 9, that poem was not published in a book until I came out with my first book in the year 2000 called What Learning Leaves. But in 98 or 99, I did have a brand new worldwide website, and I put the poem up on my worldwide website, taylormali.com. And I had a line, there were lots of pages that said, under construction and coming soon.
Yes.
And there was a button that said, click here to see an example of my poetry. And
there are a lot of frames.
Right.
A lot of frames.
You clicked on that, and there it said, what teachers make. And I just, when I was doing the coding, which I didn't even think you would have been called that, I didn't think I needed to say, what teachers make by Taylor Mali on taylormali.com. This was my website, but I didn't know. That's me. I didn't. Okay. I didn't know. It must be something I'm doing. I didn't know that it was that the audience for things on the web was going to be more than just the people who were actively looking at it. So I think a well-meaning teacher saw that poem and copied it and pasted it, and my name got unattached to it. And then people wrote versions of it. Shappy wrote a poem called "What Baby Puppy Trainers Make." People have written, "What do firefighters make? What do event planners make? What do librarians make?" It's every couple of months, a new bastardized, watered down version of the poem, makes the rounds. And for a while, I really got upset, and I would try to track down who posted this. Don't you realize that's a poem by me? And here's the original. But I don't. The truth will eventually come out. And now I have a book about the poem and my teaching philosophy called "What Teachers Make in Praise of the Greatest Job in the World." So I don't feel like I need to. True.
It's like Snaggletooth, Vaseline boob. Like it's just.
And I remember going up to Most Def and saying, "Can we rehearse whatever kind of hand gesture we're going to do in salutation?" Because I was terrified of being the white guy who, holds his hand up for a high five when he goes in for a fist bump.
Right.
And so we actually, I can't remember which season it is, which poem I'm doing, but we shake hands, and it's obvious we've kind of rehearsed what we're going to do.
So for like doing poetry, I'm sure you can kind of trace some of it back to what teachers make in some weird abstract form. But as far as like going out and actually touring with poetry, is there a connection there? How does
Let's see.
What's the progression
there?
Well,
what enabled me to quit my job as a teacher to make poetry be my job full time. I said goodbye to my 6th grade homeroom class in June of 2000, and here we are, April of 2016. So almost 16 years that I've been doing that. I've had no health insurance from my employer. And a couple of things, winning the nationals twice, and then I'll tell you, I quit teaching in June of 2000, and then I won with Urbana in August of 2000 that year. So that was that was the 3rd time I won the nationals. That made me feel, okay, this is good. This is now I'm now the only person who has ever won the National Poetry Slam with 3 different teams.
Right.
Definitely I can at least give this a year. So that helped. Def Poetry Jam happened right after September 11th.
Right.
A month after September 11th is when we taped that. So that helped. But the biggest thing, and What Teachers Make was 99, was the year before that, and that was I think the first poem that I did on Def Poetry Jam was What Teachers Make, but 2005 is when YouTube was invented.
Right.
And that's YouTube more than anything made it possible for me to do what I do, which is travel the world teaching poetry and reciting poetry. And YouTube itself, the channel, one day chose me reciting What Teachers Make as their featured video of the day.
Right.
And I think that was sort of the beginning of, that was 2006, and that I remember somebody emailing me and saying, get ready for your life to change.
Yeah.
And saying, what are you talking about? He said, you'll realize it.
You'll see, yeah. And then it becomes its own.
And then it became its own thing.
Its own thing.
Yeah. But you know what? Let me say about What Teachers Make. That poem is beginning to show its age.
Right.
Yeah, because that's a very teacher-centric poem, and I need to write a new version of What Teachers Make.
Well, that'll be a thing that I think people can go look forward to. So, as we're kind of, because I don't want to take up too much of your time.
Right.
And we're almost at an hour here. Because I have to ask about it. The Burger King voice? The voice of Burger King?
I was the voice of Burger King. Here's what I said. For 10 months, I made my living saying this, some version of this. when you have it your way, it just tastes better. Burger King. Offer available for a limited time only. Price and participation may vary. I had a former student who his father was on the creative team for Burger King, and Burger King likes to change the voice, if not the tagline, on all their commercials. I had never done voiceovers before then, but I had narrated a couple of books on tape, and I have a good speaking voice, and so Burger King didn't like any of the voices, any of the new voices, any of the typical New York City voiceover voices. And I wasn't one of those. And so I was called in and I auditioned for it and I got the job. And then I, started going on other auditions and never got something as big as like Burger King bought my first apartment. Burger King is also part of why I was able to quit my day job and become a poet, because I had this weird stroke of luck that was incredibly lucrative. And so I had saved up a lot of money to do it. And then I was able to, so now I was free during the day when auditions were. And I got a couple of other things after that. And I wrote about going on voiceovers. Because back then, 90% of all voiceover work was for white guys between the ages of 25 and 40, which is what I was.
Right.
And you'd go to these buildings where they would have casting studios, because everybody talks about I need to put that on my reel.
Right.
But you know what? In New York, you don't need a reel. It's all online. Nowadays, it's all online. And also, even back in the day, a casting director could make one phone call and have 100 white guys between the ages of 25 and 40 show up at 15-minute intervals the next day. And you go to these, and you go into the lobby, and you can tell in the lobby who the white guys who are going to the same audition as you.
Yeah.
And you get in the elevator and the audition starts in the lobby, and some white guy in the back will go, "Could someone press 7, please?" And the guy who's sitting by the buttons goes, "It's already been pressed."
Here are 100 guys who want to sound like Don LaFontaine.
Right.
That's what it's, yeah, the voice of God. Don LaFontaine.
In a world.
That dude.
In fact, that's what my poem about the voiceover industry begins with. In a world where 90% of all the voiceover work goes to white men between the ages of 25 and 40, came a white man, between the ages of 25 and 40.
So, as I say into the mic, the word So, this will make sense with the question I'm about to. You seem very particular about how you speak, how people speak.
Sure.
And how people, just before, like I said, he's like, I need to write this down. This is very interesting. Was that something that was developed through doing poetry, or was that always with you? Was that something that was ingrained in you from like family, or was that something that as you were writing poetry you became more and more?
Well, certainly the poetry made me cognizant of the importance of saying as much as you can in as few words, the economy of language. But I went to drama school before graduate school for poetry. So I was an actor, and so I've studied presentation and maintaining people's attention. So, but I don't know where I developed this hatred of filler words.
Right.
And you know what it is? When I stopped saying and nothing made me sound smarter than I actually am than that. So I'm a big fan of doing everything you can to not let the world realize what an idiot you might actually be.
Part of that, I think, is trusting silence, which I think people are very uncomfortable
Right.
with.
Yeah, particularly poets, actually. So enamored with words and so scared of the spaces between them.
I'm terrible at it.
Wait, we should just look at each other and dare each other to speak. Okay, go ahead. You're going to have to cut that out.
No, I might leave that in just because awkward silence is a thing that happens often.
And you won.
You know what's weird about that is I think I might have been holding my breath. So I was just on the verge of going, I can't do it anymore. I have always been one of the reasons post head injury that I started really getting into poetry was, number one, I kind of had to teach myself how to talk. And also, one of the reasons why I've always appreciated people like you who are very particular about language is I'm always very frustrated by what I'm saying. There isn't an adequate word or phrase for the idea that I'm trying to convey. And I think that might be one of the reasons why I still write. It's one of the reasons why I started performing poetry, was here are these ideas. I need to learn how to speak, like, get my ideas like back organized because they're kind of disjointed because my head was cracked. There it is. Now that I'm talking to you, I'm very hyper aware of them. But just the articulation of certain words and frustrating with the impreciseness of language. Do you ever encounter that, and how much does that kind of drive you mad?
Well,
or does it drive you mad?
Not as much as apparently it does you, but language will always fail. Ultimately, in its ability to express what we mean, and I'm not quite sure why that is. I know that writing, it would be, you remember Dead Poets Society. Professor Keating says, why was language developed? And the answer was to woo women, right?
Right.
Well, why was writing developed? And I wish that writing had as noble a impetus as language did. But writing happened, only 10,000 years ago. And the truth is, we developed the earliest systems of writing were developed to keep track of debt.
Yeah.
To keep track of how much you owe me. I've got a thriving basket business, and it's so big to the point that I can't remember that you owe me one goat for how many baskets I've given you.
It's also very based around livestock, actually, was one of the first, I think,
I'm
things.
not surprised.
Yeah.
Surprised. So these words and this I don't want to say language, but the writing that we use to record our poetry is at its very root the language of business and debt,
Right.
and servitude, which might explain why it's never going to be quite sufficient to express our feelings.
A feeling, yeah.
But having not had a head injury besides lingering, I'm a father now. That's a kind of a head injury,
Yes.
right? But as the older I get, I'm 51 now, and words don't come to me as quickly as they used to. But I don't think I share the level of frustration that you have.
Right.
That I can't put this into words. Maybe because I'm more comfortable with silence than you, that I trust myself to think.
Right.
That I can think about this. I can hold people's attention while I think about this, and I don't have to say or while I'm thinking about what to say. But one of the things I've always been proud about of myself is my ability to come close to saying what I mean when I'm speaking.
So just as the last thing, 'cause
Yes.
I've known you for a while, but I don't think that I know the answer to this question. Although I don't know if you were actually joking when you answered this question before. Is what is the one thing? Because this is sort of nerd themed.
Mm-hmm.
This podcast is what is the one thing that you are kind of obsessive about in your life that when you start to talk about it with other people, they kind of their eyes glaze over, or that other people don't get it.
Yeah. Well, I was being truthful to you when I said that I'm a nerd about U.S. postal regulations. We're here in my office in Brooklyn. I've got I print my own postage at home. In that closet there is filled with my postage supplies, my shipping supplies, and I can tell you that the joy that it brings when I know that I can ship out a book as a letter, not a large envelope. I know these things. I know what I can send for one first-class stamp. Remember the Forever stamp? The Forever stamp is now worth 49.5 cents. But and that's because years ago, the U.S. Postal Service went to Congress and said, "Can you please make the price of a first-class stamp be related to inflation, so that we don't have to keep coming to you to raise our rates?" And Congress said yes. However, if we give you that authority to have the price of a stamp go up and up, you have to promise us that you will produce one stamp called a Forever stamp that will always, no matter when you buy it, be worth the price of a first-class stamp. And they did that back when the price of a first-class stamp was 41 cents. And I bought 3,000 stamps back then, and I still have them. They're in my safe in the other room. So postal regulations is one thing, but the other one is a cappella. And Friday night, Caroline Rothstein and I went to the International High School Championships of a cappella and had a blast.
And just before we end, there are a couple things. This is the plugs. So number one, Page Meets Stage.
Page Meets Stage is the next one is Wednesday, May 11th at the Celebration of Whimsy. It's John Murillo meets Kate Meisner. Come to that. It's a magical pairing. And we moved to the Bowery Poetry Club in September. We're going to move to Sundays at the Bowery Poetry Club.
And is there any, I know you're working on a new book, but I don't know if we're ready to talk about that yet. But is there anything else you want to say besides
the next book is going to be called Late Father. It's about poems about my late father and about me becoming a father late. Nothing to report.
All right. Thank you.
My pleasure.